Picture this. Someone, maybe a skeptic, maybe a curious teenager, maybe your aunt after she watched a YouTube video, types one word into a Bible search engine. One result comes back. Just one. It's in the book of Acts, chapter 12, verse 4. And when you read it, something feels immediately wrong. The verse says that Herod intended to bring Peter out to the people after Easter, in a book written in the 1st century, before Christmas trees, before egg hunts, before any of what we now call Easter existed. So either the Bible contains the word Easter, or it doesn't. And the answer to that question is stranger and older and far more important than almost anyone has told you. Stay with me. The word in Acts 12:4. It is Pascha. P-A-S-C-H-A. And Pascha is the Greek form of the Hebrew word Pesach, Passover. The feast God commanded Moses to establish the night before the Exodus. The night the blood of a lamb was painted on a doorframe so that death would pass over a household and spare the firstborn son. The King James translators in 1611 made a choice. Where every other English translation before and after them wrote Passover, they wrote Easter. It was a translation decision. Not a conspiracy, not a cover-up, a decision, and one that has confused people ever since. So is Easter in the Bible? Technically, if you're holding a King James Bible, yes. Once. If you're holding almost any other translation, no. Not by that name. But here's what most people miss. That's the wrong question. Because while the word Easter may appear only once, or not at all, depending on your translation, the event that Easter points to is woven into nearly every page of the New Testament. The death of the Passover lamb, the empty tomb, the standing up again of the one who was dead. That event has a name in Greek. It's not Easter. The word is Anastasis. It means the standing up again, the rising. And there is a story buried inside that word that will change how you read the entire Bible. We will get to that word, but not yet. First, we need to go back to Acts chapter 12. Because the one verse where the King James Bible uses the word Easter is not a quiet theological verse. It is a political thriller, and it tells you everything about the world the first Christians lived in. The year is approximately AD 44. The Roman emperor is Claudius. His client king in Judea is a man named Herod Agrippa I, grandson of Herod the Great, the king who tried to kill the infant Jesus by ordering the death of every boy in Bethlehem. Agrippa has inherited his grandfather's political instincts. He knows how to read a crowd. He knows how to hold power. And he knows that the best way to secure his position with the Jewish population of Jerusalem during the most sacred week of the Jewish calendar is to give them something they want. He has already executed James, the brother of John, one of the 12. One of the men who walked with Jesus every day for 3 years. James is dead, and the crowd approved. So Agrippa does what politicians have done in every century. He goes back to the well. He arrests Peter, Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote in the 1st century and whose work has survived 2,000 years. Describes Herod Agrippa as a man who was generous to his friends, brutal to his enemies, and obsessed with public approval. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus records that Agrippa wore a robe woven entirely of silver thread to a public festival. And when the crowd called him a god, he did not correct them. He accepted the title. This is the man who is holding Peter. Peter is in prison. 16 soldiers guard him in rotating shifts of 4. 4 soldiers per watch. 4 watches per night. His wrists are chained to 2 of them. He cannot move without them moving. He cannot sleep without them feeling it. Herod is taking no chances, not after what happened the last time a follower of Jesus was locked up. When Paul and Silas sang hymns at midnight and an earthquake shook the prison doors open. Herod has heard the stories. He wants Peter alive until after the Passover, after the festival, after Pascha, and then he will execute him publicly in front of the crowd and solidify his power for another season. That is the world Acts 12 verse 4 is describing when it uses the word Easter. Not a spring celebration, not decorated eggs, not a sunrise service, a political execution. Delayed only because the most sacred week in the Jewish year had not yet ended, and killing a man during Passover would have been bad optics. Here's the part nobody tells you. The early church, the people who wrote the New Testament, the people who knew Jesus personally, the people who watched him die and saw him alive again 3 days later, they did not call their celebration Easter. They called it Pascha, Passover, because in their minds the resurrection was not a replacement for Passover. It was the fulfillment of it. The lamb slaughtered on the night of the Exodus. That was a picture, a shadow cast forward through centuries of time. The real event was a Roman cross on a hill outside Jerusalem, and a man who was both the priest and the sacrifice, both the one who applied the blood and the blood itself. They saw the connection immediately. Paul writes it plainly in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Not Christ our Easter. Christ our Pascha. Christ our Passover lamb. So where did the word Easter come from? And here where the story gets genuinely strange. In AD 725, roughly 700 years after the resurrection, an English monk named Bede sat down to write a book about the calculation of time. His name was the Venerable Bede, and he was one of the most careful scholars of his era. In that book called De Temporum Ratione, The Reckoning of Time, Bede mentioned, almost in passing, that the English month corresponding to April had once been called Eostre, the month of a goddess named Eostre. 1 paragraph. That is all Bede wrote about Eostre. No temple. No priests. No rituals. No eggs. No rabbits. No spring festival described in any detail. 1 paragraph in a Latin book about a month name, referencing a goddess who may or may not have been widely worshipped. And we are not entirely sure. And yet, from that single paragraph, an entire internet mythology has been built. Type Easter pagan origins into any search engine and you will find confident videos, confident articles, confident social media posts telling you that Easter is simply a renamed festival of a fertility goddess, and that Christians borrowed it wholesale from paganism. Pay attention to this, because what the evidence actually shows is far more complicated and far more interesting. Here is what the scholars actually say about Eostre. No Roman record mentions her. No Germanic inscription carries her name. No altar, no statue. No temple has ever been found dedicated to a goddess called Eostre. The only ancient source that names her is Bede. One monk, one paragraph, written 7 centuries after the resurrection. Some historians believe Eostre was a genuine local goddess. Others believe Bede may have invented her, or misremembered a folk tradition, or extrapolated from a month name that had nothing to do with worship at all. We simply do not know. What we do know is this: the early Christians were not sitting around in the 2nd century wondering how to rebrand a pagan spring festival. They were being fed to lions. They were hiding in catacombs. They were arguing. Fiercely, passionately, sometimes bitterly, about something far more pressing than a goddess nobody can prove existed. They were arguing about which day to celebrate the resurrection. This debate has a name. Historians call it the Quartodeciman controversy. Quartodeciman comes from the Latin for 14th. Because one side of the debate insisted that Christians should celebrate the resurrection on the 14th of Nisan, the exact date of the Jewish Passover, regardless of what day of the week it fell on. The other side, centered in Rome, insisted it must always be celebrated on a Sunday, the day of the week Jesus rose, the first day of the new creation. The two sides were not pagans and Christians. They were both Christians, and they were both reading the same scriptures. Polycarp of Smyrna, the man who had sat at the feet of the Apostle John himself, who had heard the beloved disciple speak about the night of the Last Supper. Polycarp celebrated on the 14th of Nisan. He had learned it from John. He was not going to change it because Rome preferred a different calendar. He traveled to Rome to meet with Anastasis, the bishop there. The two men disagreed. They could not reach agreement. And then, and this is the part that stops you, they celebrated communion together anyway. They prayed together. They parted as brothers. Eusebius records this meeting in his church history, written in the early 4th century. He describes it as a moment of tension and grace. Two leaders of the early church holding different practices, refusing to let the difference sever the bond. This is not a church that borrowed its most sacred celebration from a fertility goddess. This is a church so serious about the timing of that celebration that its leaders crossed the Mediterranean to argue about it face to face, and then broke bread together at the end. Here's what most people miss. The controversy was never about whether to celebrate the resurrection. Nobody in the early church debated that. The resurrection was the center, the fixed point, the one event around which everything else revolved. The only question was when, and on what calendar. And by the time the Council of Nicaea settled the question in AD 325, establishing that all Christians would celebrate on the Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox, the celebration had been continuous for 3 centuries, unbroken. Passed from the apostles to their students, from their students to the next generation, through persecution and exile and execution, through catacombs and house churches and prison cells. Nobody invented Easter in the 4th century. Nobody borrowed it from Babylon. Nobody repackaged a goddess. They were remembering. Every single year, in every place where the gospel had traveled, they were remembering the same morning. And that morning had a name long before the English language existed to give it one. There is a document that almost nobody outside seminary walls has heard of. It is called the Didache, pronounced D-I-D-A-K, pronounced from the Greek word for teaching. It is one of the oldest Christian texts in existence, written sometime between AD 50 and AD 120, possibly while some of the apostles were still alive. It is not Scripture. It was never meant to be. It is a handbook, a practical guide for new Christian communities on how to baptize, how to fast, how to pray, and how to gather for worship. And in chapter 14, it says this: on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, Sunday, come together, break bread, and give thanks. Sunday, every week, from the very beginning. Not because the church borrowed Sunday from sun worshippers, not because Constantine changed the Sabbath in the 4th century. A claim that circulates endlessly online and is contradicted by every piece of 1st century evidence we have. But because Sunday was the day the tomb was found empty. Sunday was the day Mary Magdalene ran back to tell the disciples. Sunday was the day 2 travelers on the road to Emmaus had their eyes opened over a broken loaf of bread. Sunday was the day the risen Jesus walked through locked doors and showed Thomas his hands. The church gathered on Sunday because Sunday was when everything changed. Now watch what happens next, because here is where the story moves from history into something that will genuinely stop you. Open your Old Testament to Leviticus chapter 23. This is the chapter where God gives Moses the calendar of sacred feasts. The appointed times, the modim in Hebrew, the moments in the year when heaven and earth were meant to touch. Passover on the 14th of Nisan, the Feast of Unleavened Bread beginning the 15th. And then, on the day after the Sabbath that falls within that week, a feast called Bikurim, Firstfruits. On the Feast of Firstfruits, the priest would take the very first sheaf of the barley harvest. Not the whole harvest, just the first portion, and wave it before the Lord. It was an act of faith and declaration. The harvest is not finished. Most of it is still in the ground. But this first sheaf, offered now, is a promise and a guarantee that the rest is coming. The first portion, offered in confidence that the fullness will follow. God told Moses to observe this feast every year, and for 14 centuries, Israel did. The priests waved the firstfruits sheaf, the barley was offered, the declaration was made, and then, in approximately AD 30, on the exact day of the Feast of Firstfruits, the day after the Sabbath within Passover week, a man walked out of a tomb in a garden outside Jerusalem. This is not a coincidence. The Apostle Paul, who was trained as a Pharisee, who knew the Torah with a precision most of us cannot imagine, who had memorized Leviticus before he was 13 years old. Paul looked at the resurrection and immediately reached for the language of firstfruits. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20. But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who are asleep. Not a metaphor he invented. A feast God had embedded into the Jewish calendar 14 centuries before the resurrection morning. A picture planted in Leviticus, waiting for the event that would give it its fullest meaning. The firstfruit sheaf, waved before the Lord on the day after the Sabbath. The promise that the rest of the harvest. Every person who has ever died in faith, every body in every grave, is coming. The first portion, offered in guarantee of the fullness to follow. And suddenly, Easter is not a borrowed holiday. It is a kept appointment. Go back to Acts chapter 12. Go back to the prison cell. Peter is asleep. Think about that for a moment. 16 soldiers. 2 chains. An execution scheduled for the morning after the festival ends, and Peter is asleep. Not pacing, not praying frantically with his face against the stone wall. Asleep. Deeply enough that the angel who appears in the cell has to strike him on the side to wake him up. There is only one explanation for that kind of sleep in that kind of situation. Peter had seen something that Herod had not. Peter had stood outside an empty tomb on a Sunday morning and watched a man he had denied 3 times walk out of death and back into life. And if Jesus had walked out of death, then death was not the end of the story. Not for Jesus. And not for Peter. Herod had the chains. Peter had the certainty. The angel wakes him. The chains fall off his wrists. Luke records this detail with the calm precision of a man reporting something he cannot fully explain. The chains simply fall. The guards do not wake. The iron gate that leads into the city swings open by itself, and Peter walks out into the night air of Jerusalem, free. He goes to the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, where a group of believers has gathered to pray for him. He knocks on the outer gate. A servant girl named Rhoda goes to answer it, hears Peter's voice, and is so overwhelmed that she runs back inside without opening the gate, leaving Peter standing outside, still knocking, while she tells everyone their prayers have been answered. They do not believe her. "You're out of your mind," they tell her, and then they suggest it must be his angel. As if a ghost knocking on a gate is somehow more plausible than a living man, Peter keeps knocking. When they finally open the gate and see him standing there, alive, unchained, free, Luke says they were astonished. The Greek word is existami. It means to be displaced from yourself. To be so shocked that, for a moment, you are not quite present in your own body. They had prayed for this, and when it arrived, they could not believe it. Here's what most people miss about that moment. What happened to Peter in that prison cell was a small Anastasis, a small resurrection, chains falling, a gate opening, a man walking out of a place he was never supposed to leave alive. Luke is not being subtle. He is painting a picture, deliberately, carefully, that mirrors the larger event the entire book of Acts is built upon. Because Anastasis, the standing up again, is not just a theological term. It is the word the New Testament uses more than any other to describe what happened on that Sunday morning in the garden. It appears over 40 times. It is the word Peter uses in his first sermon at Pentecost. It is the word Paul stakes his entire ministry on in Athens. It is the word Martha speaks to Jesus outside the tomb of Lazarus, and the word Jesus speaks back to her. I am the resurrection. Ego eimi hi Anastasis, not I will cause a resurrection. Not I can perform a resurrection. I am the resurrection. The standing up again is not something Jesus does. It is something Jesus is. And when you understand that, when that word moves from your head into your chest, the question, is Easter in the Bible, dissolves, because you realize you have been asking the wrong question all along. The right question is not whether a word is in the Bible. The right question is whether the event that word points to is in the Bible. And the answer to that question is everywhere. So let's bring it all the way back. Someone types Easter into a Bible search engine. One result. Acts 12:12, verse 4. A mistranslation of Pascha, and for a moment it seems like the skeptics are right. Easter is not in the Bible. The word was borrowed from an English monk's footnote about a month name and a goddess nobody can definitively prove existed. And yet, the event that Easter points to, the standing up again, the Anastasis, is not borrowed from anywhere. It is not a repackaged myth. It is not a seasonal metaphor about winter ending and spring beginning. It is a specific claim made by specific people about a specific morning in a specific garden outside a specific city in a specific year. A morning that 14 centuries of Jewish feast days had been quietly, precisely pointing toward the Passover lamb, the Feast of Firstfruits, the day after the Sabbath, the first sheaf waved before the Lord as a guarantee that the rest of the harvest is coming. It was all there, planted in Leviticus, waiting. And now 3 takeaways, not 3 things to remember for a Bible trivia night. 3 things that change how you live. The first is this. The resurrection is the most verified claim in the ancient world that most people have never seriously investigated. Josephus mentions Jesus. Tacitus mentions the execution under Pontius Pilate and the movement that refused to die after it. The early church, people who had everything to lose and nothing material to gain, built their entire lives on the claim that one specific man walked out of one specific tomb. They did not do this because they borrowed a spring festival from a half-remembered goddess. They did it because something happened that they could not explain any other way. You owe it to yourself to look at the evidence, not the internet's version of it. The actual evidence. The second takeaway is this. The church that argued passionately about which day to celebrate the resurrection. The church of Polycarp and Anastasis, who disagreed and then broke bread together. The church understood something we have largely forgotten. The resurrection is not a doctrine you defend. It is a morning you return to every year, every Sunday. Every time you break bread and remember that the first fruit sheaf has already been waved and the rest of the harvest is guaranteed. You are not waiting for something uncertain. You are waiting for something promised. And there is a difference between those 2 kinds of waiting that changes everything about how you carry yourself through a hard week. And the third takeaway, the one that matters most, is the word itself. The standing up again. Peter in a prison cell, chains on his wrists, asleep, not because he was naive, not because he had stopped thinking about the execution scheduled for the morning, but because he had seen something Herod had not seen, and it had rearranged everything inside him. The standing up again was not a future possibility he was hoping for. It was a present reality he was resting in. There is a moment, and perhaps you know this moment, when the worst thing you can imagine has either already happened or feels like it is about to. When the chains feel real, and the morning feels impossible, and the gate feels permanently shut. That is exactly the moment this word was made for. Not Easter the holiday, not Easter the controversy, not Easter the pagan or not debate that fills comment sections every April. The standing up again. The Anastasis. The God who does not leave his people in chains in the dark. He is still in the business of opening gates.